Have you ever wondered why so many geniuses died in obscurity? Van Gogh sold only one painting during his lifetime. Nietzsche, whose ideas revolutionized Western thought, died virtually ignored. Tesla, the man who literally lit up the world, spent his final days alone in a hotel room. There's something deeply unsettling about the way our world treats its brightest minds, as if genius carries with it an invisible curse. Today, we're going to dive into this fascinating phenomenon and uncover why society so often rejects those who see beyond the common horizon. Get ready to question everything you believe about success, recognition, and the true cost of originality. The story of humanity is dotted with geniuses who had to fight against a tide of misunderstanding and rejection. From Socrates, condemned to death for corrupting the youth with his critical thinking, to Alan Turing, whose contributions to modern computing were overshadowed by persecution for his sexuality, there seems to be a troubling pattern. Genius, in its purest essence, often comes with an almost unbearable burden of social and cultural isolation. But what exactly causes this persistent rejection of the brightest minds? The first factor to consider is what psychologists call the normalcy bias. Humans are tribal creatures, evolutionarily programmed to distrust anything that deviates drastically from the average behavior of the group. This mechanism, which served us well for thousands of years in identifying threats, becomes a hindrance when faced with revolutionary ideas. As Aristotle observed, there is no great genius without a touch of madness, and society tends to focus more on the madness than the genius. A truly original mind operates on a different plane of perception. In his studies on exceptional creativity, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi found that true innovators often possess what he called a complex personality, the ability to navigate between contradictory extremes. They can be simultaneously introverted and extroverted, disciplined and playful, humble and proud. This internal complexity that fuels their creativity is precisely what makes them incomprehensible to many around them. It's like trying to explain colors to someone who only sees in black and white. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, himself a neglected genius in his time, wrote that talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target no one else can see. This is precisely the dilemma. How do you value something whose importance you can't even comprehend? Most people judge ideas by their familiarity, not their intrinsic merit. That's why Galileo faced the Inquisition, Darwin was ridiculed, and countless avant-garde artists died in poverty. Established power structures also play a crucial role in this dynamic. As Foucault might argue, knowledge is intrinsically tied to power, and those who control institutions have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Truly revolutionary minds pose a threat to this established order. When Einstein proposed his theory of relativity, he wasn't just challenging Newtonian physics, but an entire paradigm of thought that upheld the intellectual hierarchies of the time. The paradox is that while society often rejects its geniuses in life, it is voracious in claiming them after their death. Van Gogh, whose paintings are now worth millions, could barely afford paint while he was alive. Nietzsche, widely celebrated today as one of the most influential philosophers of the modern world, saw his books ignored for decades. This posthumous appropriation reveals something deeply hypocritical about our relationship with genius. We want its fruits without having to deal with the complicated person who produced them. Geniuses themselves often contribute to their isolation. Their obsession with ideas and visions that others don't share can make them socially awkward or inept. Steve Jobs, known for his brilliant vision in design and innovation, was also notorious for his volatile temper and lack of empathy. This intensity, so vital to his creative process, made it difficult for many to work with him. The genius zone often overlaps with the socially intolerable zone. Evolutionary psychology offers another interesting perspective. In primitive groups, individuals who thought radically differently posed a potential risk to collective survival. Today, While our environment has changed drastically, our basic instincts remain. As anthropologist Joseph Henrich observed, humans are ultra-social. Our natural tendency is to conform to group norms, not challenge them. Those who dare to think differently face the resistance of millions of years of evolutionary programming. The German philosopher Hegel spoke of the spirit of the time, or Zeitgeist, the intellectual and cultural mindset of a specific era. Many geniuses were simply born outside their ideal zeitgeist. Ada Lovelace's ideas about computing were a century ahead of her time. Composer Bach was considered outdated during his lifetime, only to be rediscovered and revered decades after his death. As Vincent van Gogh once said, "What would life be if we had no courage to attempt anything new?" But that courage often finds no echo among contemporary. Educational institutions also bear some of the blame. As Sir Ken Robinson eloquently argued, our educational systems were designed for conformity, not to nurture eccentric genius. Exceptionally bright children are often labeled as problematic when they don't fit into standardized molds. How many potential geniuses have been silenced by a system that values the ability to reproduce expected answers over authentic originality? It's a question that haunts any serious discussion about talent and human potential. The loneliness of genius is intensified by what psychologists call the burden of the pioneer. Those at the forefront of human thought have no natural peers with whom to share their ideas. Albert Einstein described this isolation when he said, "It is strange to be known so universally and yet be so lonely." True innovation happens at the edges of human knowledge, a place inherently lonely, inhabited only by those willing to sacrifice the comfort of belonging for the possibility of discovery. Modern capitalism, with its emphasis on immediate utility and measurable returns, creates a particularly hostile environment for certain types of genius. Markets may reward technological innovation well, but they are notoriously poor at valuing philosophical, artistic, or theoretical advances that lack immediate commercial application. As Oscar Wilde observed, "Nowadays people know the price of everything and the value of nothing," a remark that has only grown more relevant in our age of metrics and quantification. There's also a neurological dimension to consider. Recent neuroscience studies suggest that exceptionally creative brains process information in fundamentally different ways. Atypical neural connections that allow for remote associations, the foundation of genuine creativity, can also manifest as behaviors society deems strange or inappropriate. The line between neurodivergence and genius is often thin, as demonstrated by figures like Tesla, who exhibited traits consistent with what we would now call obsessive-compulsive disorder. The ultimate irony of this curse of genius is that the very originality that makes someone a genius also makes them virtually impossible to understand by their contemporaries. Plato articulated this in his allegory of the cave. The one who sees the world outside the cave returns to tell the others, only to be ridiculed and rejected. The true visionary is doomed to see what others cannot, and even more doomed to try to communicate it in a world that isn't ready to listen. In the end, perhaps rejection is the inevitable price of true originality. As Kierkegaard suggested, the existential anguish that comes with being ahead of one's time is both a curse and a gift. History shows that truly transformative geniuses rarely find acceptance in their lifetimes. Their consolation, if there is any, is the possibility that future generations will finally understand the value of what they created. As Emily Dickinson, another genius unrecognized in her lifetime, once said, "If I can stop one heart from breaking, I shall not live in vain." Identifying and nurturing genius is not just a philosophical question, but a practical skill that can transform lives and potentially the course of human history. As Maslow observed in his studies of self-actualized individuals, extraordinary potential often remains latent without the right environment to flourish. So how can we recognize and cultivate genius around us, whether in our children, students, colleagues, or even ourselves? The first step in recognizing potential genius is to let go of preconceived notions about how it manifests. Contrary to popular belief, genius rarely appears as a universal skill set or an astronomical IQ. As Howard Gardner demonstrated in his theory of multiple intelligences, excellence can flourish in specific domains. From linguistic intelligence to bodily kinesthetic, from logical mathematical to interpersonal. The next Einstein might not be solving equations, but revolutionizing art, music, or creating innovative social systems. True genius is often asymmetrical, extraordinary in specific areas, sometimes even deficient in others. Pay attention to persistent questioners. Truly original minds rarely accept conventional answers. As Socrates demonstrated, genius often begins not with answers, but with questions no one else is asking. Richard Feynman, the legendary physicist, attributed his genius not to superior intelligence, but to his willingness to remain confused longer than his peers, persisting with questions others abandon. When someone in your circle asks questions that seem naive, but no one can answer satisfactorily, you might be in the presence of a mind capable of transcending existing conceptual limits. Environments that nurture genius share common characteristics that we can consciously cultivate. Researcher Teresa Amabile identified 3 essential components of exceptional creativity: expertise in a specific domain, creative thinking skills, and intrinsic motivation. That last element, the authentic passion for a subject, independent of external rewards, is often the most critical and the most overlooked in our reward-based systems. To nurture genius, we must create spaces where exploration for the pure love of knowledge is not only allowed but celebrated. Tolerance for failure is another fundamental characteristic of environments that produce exceptional innovation. Thomas Edison famously said he didn't fail 10,000 times while trying to invent the light bulb. He successfully found 10,000 ways that didn't work. This mental resilience develops only when failure is reframed as valuable information, not as a termination point. In practices like IDEO's spectacular failure, one of the world's leading design firms, the most instructive mistakes are publicly celebrated, creating a culture where bold experimentation becomes possible. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi discovered that the flow state, that deep immersion where time seems to disappear, is where exceptional creativity often occurs. To nurture genius, we must fiercely protect periods of uninterrupted focus. In our age of constant distraction, creating temporary bubbles of deep concentration might be the most revolutionary act to cultivate extraordinary minds. Cal Newport, in his work on deep work, suggests specific rituals and environmental reconfigurations that can facilitate these highly productive mental states. Recognizing genius in children requires an especially attentive and nuanced approach. Asynchronous development, when a child shows exceptionally advanced abilities in certain areas while remaining average or even below average in others, is often a marker of extraordinary potential. Similarly, obsessive and sustained interest in specific topics, heightened sensitivity, whether emotional, sensory, or intellectual, and the ability to make unusual connections between seemingly unrelated ideas can signal an unconventional mind that deserves special cultivation. For those in leadership positions, nurturing genius means creating what Google has called psychological safety. Environments where heterodox ideas can be expressed without fear of ridicule. Researcher Amy Edmondson found that the most innovative teams aren't necessarily the most harmonious, but those where respectful disagreement is normalized and risky contributions are valued. As a leader, your reactions to failures and unconventional ideas set the tone. Every negative response to an unorthodox suggestion teaches the entire organization to play it safe. Perhaps the most overlooked aspect of developing genius is the need for unstructured time. Nietzsche's perspective on this topic is particularly revealing. He argued that moments of profound boredom are essential for truly original thought. In our culture of perpetual productivity, carving out time for what seems like doing nothing has become almost heretical. Yet it is precisely in these seemingly unproductive spaces that remote associations, the essence of originality, often occur. As Einstein observed, his deepest insights didn't come from hours of intense calculation, but during walks or while playing the violin. Finally, recognizing and nurturing genius requires us to cultivate a tolerance for what psychologist Kazimierz Dabrowski called positive disintegration, those turbulent periods of questioning and reformulation that often precede significant breakthroughs. The brightest minds often go through phases that may seem concerning from the outside. Deep existential questioning, rejection of social conventions, or immersion in ideas that seem bizarre to others. In these critical phases, offering support without judgment can make the difference between a genius who flourishes and one who retreats into conformity. As a society, our challenge is not just to identify and nurture exceptional minds, but to create a culture where original thinking is valued in every area of life. As philosopher Martha Nussbaum argued, a healthy democracy requires citizens capable of critical thinking and empathetic imagination, precisely the qualities that characterize many forms of genius. Perhaps our most important task is not to cultivate a few extraordinary geniuses, but to recognize and nurture the seeds of originality in everyone. If this deep dive into the psychology of genius resonated with you, don't let that connection fade. Click the subscribe button now and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our upcoming videos, exploring the mysteries of the human mind. Your like is more than just a click. It's a signal to the algorithm that profound content like this deserves to be amplified. And please, share your own experiences or thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever felt misunderstood for thinking differently? Or do you know a modern genius who deserves more recognition? The conversation we're starting here only gets richer with your contribution.